Craig Fox, Harold Williams Professor of Management and Psychology at UCLA. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's first talk about your field. How would you describe your field of research?
Well, I'm a behavioral decision theorist, which means I'm interested in descriptive questions about how people make judgments and decisions under conditions of uncertainty, as opposed to a normative theorist who would be interested in questions of what is a rational way of making decisions, or a prescriptive theorist who might develop tools for guiding people in making better decisions.
What are the central questions your field tackles concerning decision making?
Well, decision theorists of all stripes, I think, agree that decisions under uncertainty are influenced by people's preferences and their beliefs. And the central question that behavioral decision theorists ask is how people actually do that. Some psychologists are interested in questions of process, how our minds compute subjective probabilities and how they integrate information about beliefs and preferences in order to make decisions.
What would its most notable findings be?
Well, I think we've learned a lot in the last 40 years or so about ways in which we fall short of the Olympian standards of rationality that are advanced in the normative models and traditional neoclassical models. For one thing, I think we've learned that the way in which people cognitively represent events is critical, and it can make a big difference in terms of the judgments and the decisions that people make. For instance, if they represent outcomes in terms of losses versus gains, that can influence their risk preferences. Also, we've learned a lot about judged probabilities and the mental shortcuts people use to generate subjective probabilities off the tops of their heads, but also ways in which they judge the likelihood of critical events in incoherent ways, predictably incoherent ways that violate the normative rules of chance and probability. We also have learned something about the way in which people weight probabilities and how that departs from standards of rationality. And finally, I'd say another big area is how people's attitude towards the source of uncertainty influences their decisions under uncertainty, how their feelings, for instance, concerning the ambiguity of probabilities of unfamiliar events can influence their willingness to act under uncertainty. So I would say those are some of the main themes.
Thank you. Could you give one or two examples of these findings in action?
Sure. With respect to the way in which events are represented, first of all, if I don't represent an event as a possibility, maybe I haven't experienced it. I'm a doctor who is testing out a new vaccine, and I'm learning about the probability of adverse side effects by observing what happens through experience. If I never observe an adverse side effect, I may come to stop representing that as a possibility. It's a low probability event that I've just never sampled in my experience, and therefore it doesn't influence my decision making subsequently. Or another example of representation, as I mentioned, is if the same decision consequences are represented in terms of possible gains, like survival rate in an operation, then people tend to be risk averse. If they're represented in terms of losses, then they tend to be more risk seeking, generally speaking. In the context of judged probabilities, we know that people tend to rely on mental shortcuts to make a complex judgment of what is more likely, more tractable to our minds, which are limited in their ability to process information and limited in their access to information. So if I ask you, are there more orange cars or blue cars on the road in Paris, most people could accurately give the answer blue, and they do it not by checking records with the Department of Motor Vehicles or doing some sort of random sampling. They can do it based on their memory. And we learn from experience that if it's easier to recall instances of an event, it tends to be more likely in the world. And in this case, I would correctly say, okay, it's easier to recall having seen instances of blue cars, so I'm going to answer that blue are more common. Where that gets us into trouble is situations where ease of recall diverges systematically from frequency in the world, and oftentimes stories that are covered in the media are not representative, but they're played up in the media precisely because they're unusual. For instance, most people think that murders are more common than suicides, but in the United States at least, suicides are twice as common as murders. And people don't get that because they hear much more in the media and movies and so forth about murders than they do about suicides. Moreover, when you ask people to judge probabilities of events, as a second example, they tend to focus on the event, and the alternative events that could happen tend to be blended together in people's minds. So what that leads to is a pattern that we call subadditivity, that if you break down a space of possible events into several different possibilities and have people judge them each, they tend to add up to more than 100%. For instance, you can imagine a situation where there's a basketball tournament in which there are 8 teams who could win the championship remaining in the playoffs. If I ask you one at a time what's the probability that each of those teams win, most people would give probabilities that sum to more than 100%. I focus on the first team, and I think about that team winning against all that other stuff, all those other possible teams that blend together. Then I focus on the second team against all those teams that blend together, you see. So the multifarious alternatives sort of blend together, recede into the background, and we get this focal bias, which elevates the probability, since that's one example of how people's judged probabilities can be systematically and predictably biased. With respect to the ambiguity question, we know that people tend to find imprecise or unfamiliar or vague probabilities more aversive to bet on than precise known probabilities, which is a problem for the normative theory to account for. And it's worse than that, because in a lot of research, some of which I've contributed to, we find that people's attitude towards uncertain events is influenced by their subjective perception of their own relative knowledge, which can vary by context. For instance, we ran a study years ago where we asked people to tell us whether they thought Boris Yeltsin or Gennady Zyuganov would win the Russian election. And at the time, people weren't so sure that, who was going to win that election. And then we asked them whether they would rather have $50 for sure or $150 if the person that they selected would win the Russian election. Now, for half of these individuals, we preceded that question by a question: do you think that Clinton or Dole will win the American election that year? That was a much more familiar event. So now when they get to the question about the Russian election, they feel very ignorant, relatively speaking, and most people say, I'll take $50 for sure. But in another condition where we asked the same population of individuals, first, do you think that Fernandez or Cortez or whoever it was will win this year's election in the Dominican Republic, a much less familiar event? Now, by the time they get to the Russian election question, they feel comparatively competent. And indeed, most people chose to bet on their forecast of the Russian election. So this shows how people's attitudes towards ambiguity, influence their sense of confidence betting under uncertainty, and how that can move around in predictable ways that are difficult to reconcile with the normative model.
Talking about the normative model, let's turn to the normative question of how potentially severe uncertainty should guide decision making or be reflected in it, and our general attitude, the general attitude in your field to this issue. Are there standardly accepted replies in your field to this question?
To what question?
The question of the normative question of how uncertainty should be reflected in decision.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the way I think about the landscape, there are really 3 foundations in decision theory. The normative one: what is rational behavior? What does it mean to behave rationally? And how do we model that? 2 is the descriptive questions, which I tend to ask and my colleagues do in my field. And then the 3rd is the prescriptive question about, knowing that we tend to fall short in systematic and predictable ways, how do we get from that to more normative behavior? Thus, I would say most people in my field generally accept most of the principles of normative theory as guidelines for how we should behave in an optimal world, with some rare exceptions.
Would the general view in your field be that it has anything to contribute on the question of how decisions in the face of severe uncertainty, say climate policy or foreign policy, or examples like those, should be taken?
Well, as I've said, I think that management students and policy students and scholars are really interested ultimately in prescriptive questions. What is a process that will facilitate me acting in ways that we might consider if not more rational, at least more favorable. And here I think that most people in behavioral decision theory believe that our field can contribute some insights about ways in which people are naturally likely to fall short, and also ways to use the tools of decision analysis in a more effective way. For instance, one tool of decision analysis that's in very common use is to create decision trees, where we model the possible consequences of various kinds of decisions and the impact that uncertainty has on those outcomes. And so one common procedure that a lot of decision analysts might use is when they identify a chance node in a decision tree, you seek the expertise of an individual who can give you guidance on how to assign probabilities to those outcomes. Well, we know from our research that the way in which you partition the state space, the specific ways in which you divide up the set of possible events into events that you query of the expert, can actually distort the judgments, the probability judgments that you get from even people with a great deal of expertise. Having that insight can help us develop better tools, better principles to guide the elicitation of probabilities even from experts, so that we have a better input, more accurate input into the decision models that guide more desirable behavior.
Let's talk about your view. Let's consider the sorts of high-stakes radical uncertainty decisions we've been talking about so far. Okay, so for example, fixing policy on climate change or energy or any of these issues. And suppose that you are asked for some general practical advice on how these sorts of uncertainties should be dealt with in the decision-making process.
Wait, so you're asking an academic for practical advice? A theoretician? No, I'm joking, of course.
I'm sorry, it's a hypothetical choice. I'm allowed to ask psychologists hypothetical choices.
This is one of the interesting things about teaching in a business school. So, of course, I'm a behavioral decision theorist and I develop new theories, but I try to talk to business students and executives about what is this stuff good for. And I think that there is a lot that it's good for. Even though that's not a central focus of the research, I think that there are a lot of practical implications of it that would benefit from further direct investigation of their application. But what I will say is this, that we've talked about some of the components of how people actually make decisions and how we can go wrong. I think that the research, the theoretical research, really sheds a light on what are the areas where we need to be very careful to develop new tools and new guidance to help people running afoul of some of the errors that we're apt to make. So for instance, I talked about representation being important. An awareness that we tend to miss a lot. For instance, we tend to, Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner who wrote about decision-making and judgment under uncertainty, talks about the Wisiati principle, he calls it, which stands for what you see is all there is. So there's a bias when we represent probability distributions over outcomes in our minds, even if it's informally, to focus on the information we know that's in front of us and neglect the information that we're missing, the things we know we don't know, if you will. And so I think we can provide some guidance on prompting people to have greater awareness of the things that they're missing so that they can create more accurate representations of what the possible consequences are of their decisions and what the uncertainties are. With respect to probability weighting, for instance, we know that people tend to overweight low probability events and underweight high probability events, and we can give them guidance to correct that. With respect to the impact of ambiguity on people's confidence and willingness to act, I think a general awareness of how context of questions influences people can help us expunge those kinds of biases from people's decision-making process. These are a few examples. And earlier I gave an example of how in probability elicitation we can try and help people come up with tools for helping people to avoid the pitfalls of these sub-additive, systematically incoherent probabilities to make them more internally consistent and therefore hopefully more accurate. These are some examples.
These are some very interesting examples. Would you consider them to be cases illustrating a more general principle, for example?
Well, I guess the more general principle that they illustrate is we can't take rationality of decision makers for granted, even when they're trying to provide guidance in the context of formal decision analysis, and even when they have a lot of sophistication about those normative principles. We need to expect that people are going to fall short of those Olympian standards of rationality that are taken for granted by normative theorists, and use them to inform the use of better, improved tools for making more rational decisions under uncertainty.
In your view, what are the central challenges for the development of a proper account of uncertainty and how?
A proper account? You mean a proper descriptive account? Yeah. Well, it's going to take us a while to get there if we ever get there. Of course, science is an iterative process that slowly builds on itself. But I would say that the challenges are twofold. One is, and this has been a topic that I've spent most of my career working on in incremental ways, we know something about how people make decisions under very idealized conditions of decision under risk, where we know what the probability distribution of outcomes is. We play around with people's decisions concerning chance gambles. It's like Mendel's pea pods or fruit flies for geneticists, right? They can be informative, but they can be informative about a very narrow kind of decision making in gambling situations, for instance, or situations where we have a very clear sense of probability distributions from past frequencies. The big challenge has been for many years to bring those kinds of models to a world that is much more realistic and complex. In naturalistic environments, of course, we don't know the probabilities precisely, and all these other kinds of complications that I've mentioned about representation, about subjective degree of competence or confidence enter in. And so the challenge is, how do you enrich those models in a way that encompasses these diverse phenomena that we've been discussing, these diverse sets of biases, in a way that is both tractable and realistic? Because the second challenge, I think, moving forward is some of those phenomena do not lend themselves readily to a crisp formal model. I mentioned earlier this ambiguity aversion phenomenon and how people's willingness to act under uncertainty is influenced by their degree of confidence, which in turn can be influenced by their state of mind. What other events do I happen to be thinking about when I'm making a decision about betting on the Russian election, as in the example I gave earlier? Do I happen to be thinking about something I know more about, the American election, or something I know less about, the Russian election, the Dominican Republic election? And so modeling state of mind is something that may ultimately resist any sort of formal modeling, and we have to maybe be satisfied with a more qualitative form of accounts to explain some decision phenomena.
Okay. So moving forward, the idea would be to improve the models we've got as far as we can, and after that, kind of add to those models qualitative elements where we can't, where it looks like they've.
I think so. I mean, that's part of it in terms of the formal modeling, I think. I mean, you asked about challenges, and I think that's a big challenge, is to really understand behavior better under naturalistic uncertainty. That said, I think that there's still a very rich agenda yet to be pursued. The American former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said famously during a press conference about the Iraq War that there are known knowns, which is to say there are things we know, and there are known unknowns, things we don't know, and then there are unknown unknowns, things we don't know. And while he was much lampooned for making that statement, which sounded incoherent, actually, in my personal opinion, I think it's one of the smartest things the guy ever said. And what it highlights is, I think, at least for me in my research and my own idiosyncratic view perhaps of the field, is that we should focus on understanding metacognition under uncertainty. They say that knowledge is power. I think that what's more powerful than that is meta-knowledge, knowledge about what we know and what we don't know, and situations under which we don't know what we don't know, and more than that, what is knowable and what is inherently random. And so I think the development of better tools for making better decisions under real naturalistic uncertainty will benefit from progress understanding metacognition under uncertainty, understanding how does our feeling, our sense of what we know, How accurate is that, and how does that influence our decisions under uncertainty? I talked about ambiguity aversion and how my sense of how competent or knowledgeable I am is inherently relative to what other things I happen to be thinking about and how that can move people up and down in their decisions. Known unknowns. So that's known knowns. Known unknowns would be an awareness of things we don't know. And with a student of mine, Daniel Walters, we've looked at, and some other colleagues, we've looked at how drawing people's attention explicitly to the things that they don't know can improve the calibration of their judgment. Not only does it reduce their inappropriate overconfidence, but it's very selective in that it doesn't really move them too much in situations where they were already calibrated or in fact underconfident, right? So just directing people's attention, giving them some discipline, some tools for thinking about the stuff they don't know can be helpful. That's one example. As for the unknown unknowns, the things like these black swan events, there's much to be done there. Understanding about what are the kinds of environments where we don't represent an event as a possibility because we haven't experienced it. And helping provide people with rich experience and help people understand how to treat the uncertainty by giving them simulated experience. I think there are lots of directions to go with respect to the unknown unknowns. For me personally, one of the most exciting areas of our current research is understanding the meta questions of what people see as knowable versus inherently random or stochastic. And in our research, we found that there are big individual differences and domain differences in how we think about the nature of uncertainty in that domain. And that influences people's behavior in investing. It influences how people talk to each other about uncertainty. It influences people's understanding of health information that's provided to them. I imagine it could also influence talk about environmental outcomes.
Craig Fox, thank you.
All right, thanks very much.